Hello, welcome to Sylvie showing you how to sew a book sleeve. The what are they called? Pocket way. The pocket way. I'm not editing this, but I am using the pause function in the camera settings, in the camera thingo. But this is what we're gonna make. We don't need to do this, but I'll show you how to do it, just so you know how. Yeah. First step is to cut out all of your layers, which we've done before. You know how to do that. You have your 2 layers of batting, 1 for each side, 2 layers of lining, 1 for each side, and 2 layers of your fashion fabric, 1 for each side. Crazy, I know. Also, I'm realizing I'm looking at the screen, not at the camera. Anyways, step 1 is the same that we did the last time, but we're changing it slightly, so that instead of sewing all 3 layers, I don't know why I picked it up. Anyways, so instead of sewing all 3 layers of front, middle lining, we're going to be sewing, this is not making sense, we're sewing our front side to our middle, and we are not sewing on, here we are, the lining. My lining is different to my outer fabric. Yours doesn't have to be, but it does make it easier for you to see what's inside, what's outside when I'm showing you how to make this. What you use doesn't matter as long as you know which is which, and it doesn't really matter either way. If it's the same fabric, doesn't matter. Anyways, mine's different fabric, so it does matter. My outside layer to my middle, just around the edges like we did the first time, keeping your fashion fabric down towards the sewing machine so your needle will poke through the batting first. This makes it easier to line up the batting to your fashion fabric. So I can't turn the camera around to show you, so this is just going to be the awkward way. We have the stitch length set to 5mm, which is the longest that my machine goes. Doesn't matter, this way, doesn't matter where your needle is. I've just got mine, I've got mine in the middle, just because that's what's easier for me. And then over here you can see how I've got it set up. Smooth. As you can see, my batting doesn't really line up to the edge of my fabric. I might have cut it a little bit too small. This is why we cut it bigger than we think we need it to be. Anyways, what I am going to do is I'm just going to pull it a little bit, kind of break it apart so it's a little bit thinner. If you have scraps, you can, like, if it's like a big section, like honestly this is probably too big, I should use the scraps. Anyways, add the scraps in and just sew them down with your stitches. When you do the quilting, they'll be secured in place a bit better. You just have to be a little bit more careful with how you're doing that. I've got to a point, oh wait, hang on, I should, this way is not upside down, here we go. Got to a point where I'll start adding in my scraps, so I'll just tuck that under the presser foot there before I keep continuing on. Put my foot down and then continue to sew, and if it starts to pull apart like it is in there, just tuck a little bit more in and continue to sew. You get it. Doesn't look as incredibly pretty as if it was one piece, but it will be better functionally and you'll get better quilting results on the other side of your fabric. Now we're going to start doing the other side. It's the same thing, the outside layer and the middle layer, and sew around the edges just like we did. Lol. There we go. Piece 1 and 2 basted to the backing fabric. Now the next step is we're going to do our quilting lines. So we're going to do that the same way that we did it last time, where we grab a ruler, grab a pen, and we're going to draw lines on our quilt, on our piece of fabric, to follow when we do the quilting. Make sure you do this with like a heat erase pen or something that will wash off easily, like a water erase pen or an air erase pen, something like that. so that way you can get rid of the lines easily, obviously, and they don't get shown through when you do the pattern, because we have to do the lines on our outside of the fabric. Because this fabric already has lines, I'm doing it the cheating way, and I'm not going to draw lines, but I recommend that you do draw lines so that you get nice straight lines. I'm just going to do a box pattern, but you can do like diamonds or whatever else you like, however you like to do it. Yeah. Before you sew your lines, also remember to switch your stitch length, that one, back to normal. So back to 2.5, which is the typical stitch length on most machines. Whatever your standard is, I just press the button and it makes it what I want it to be, because you want to make sure that you're using the right stitch length for your quilting lines so that they show up nicely and look all pretty. So I've finished quilting both sides. You can see the texture on the front. What we're going to do now is you're going to figure out which way you want your top to be. It doesn't really matter. That's going to be my top, I've just decided. As long as both sides, like if you've cut them the same way, or if you've got a directional fabric, whether it's obvious that the pattern's at the top, then you do need to worry, but oops, no, that's not a good example. Anyways, you know what I'm saying. If it's directional, then you have a top and a bottom. Not as important, and as long as you've cut your fabric the right way. So we're going to take this fabric, that's my top, and this is our lining, and we're going to sew them right sides together. So my lining fabric doesn't have a right side, but if yours does, like this one does, then make sure you're putting them right sides together. You can see my lining is actually a little bit too small again, but it's okay, better too small than too big. And we're going to just sew along the top there. So seam across the top here, and what we've now done is we've created the top of our book sleeve. And we're going to do the same to the other side. You want to make sure that you have at least a centimetre of seam allowance at the top and for all of your seams when you sew this thing together, particularly wanting to make sure that you go over your basting stitches that you did at the start. If they are too low, that's okay. Keep your line over, like the priority of keeping the line is higher than make sure you go over the basting stitch. Oh my gosh, my brain. Anyways, keeping your line, because you can remove your basting stitch if you haven't caught it, and that's why we made it on such a long stitch length. That, and also it's good to sew it that way. Not a vital step, but losing a game of bob and chicken is not mandatory, very optional, still annoying. Now I have to rewind my bobbin. Anyways, okay, so as you can see, my lining is a little bit shorter than I had hoped it would be, but honestly it doesn't matter. I'm just going to make my seams a little bit, my seam allowance on the outside fabric just a little bit bigger, just making sure that they line up. You can also trim them to be the same length. I don't want to do that because I'm lazy, but you can do that. But now we have both our pieces sewn together. What we're going to do is what we call an edge stitch. That's what I call it anyways, which is we're folding the seam allowance, which is, you know, that bit where our seam sits, all the leftover fabric. We're going to fold that towards our lining side, and we're going to, from the top down, so from the right side down, without, you can see it through the fabric, we're going to do a stitch just beside the seam, just there. So that's our edge stitch. You can't really see it, so if you like to see the lighting, there you go, that's the edge stitch. For things like garments and stuff, you want it closer to the seam, like not on the seam, but close to it. This helps keep the lining in the position that we want it, and keeps your edge nice and crisp. When your layers aren't as thick as this, it does make a bigger difference. I do the edge stitching on all of my dress necklines, so you don't see the seam, you don't see the stitching on the outside, but it keeps the lining in place nicely. So now that we've done that, we'll move on to the next step. Next step is to put our two pieces together, right sides together, making sure obviously that you have your two quilted sides on one side and your two lining sides on the other side. And we're going to check that, this is hard to show you how, wait, you're going to check that your where the lining connects to the outside fabric, that it lines up on both sides, and then clip it in place, and that way when you turn it around, they'll line up the whole way around the top of the book sleeve. Oh, I forgot the step for the elastic. Anyways, we'll do it a different way. So for the elastic, what we're supposed to do is sew it on one side in this seam before sewing the lining to the top of the fabric, to the top, you know, before sewing the lining to the outside. We're supposed to stitch in our elastic facing down this way. I forgot to do it. I forgot to do it last time too. I've made 3 of these. This is number 3. And I only did it for number 2, and I've now forgotten again. Doing great. Anyways, right, what we're doing, sewing these together and making sure that the edges line up. All nice, if you can see, they line up. And same for the other side. They also need to line up, which is tricky to do one-handed, but we make it work. Anyway, make them line up, clip them in place, and then we're going to start sewing from this side, just above, around to the bottom, and then sew from the other side down to the bottom, and then we sew the bottom up. I'll show you. So I have one side clipped so I can make sure that my side is lined up, and this side I have sewn down just the one side to make sure that all the edges will line up a bit better. It's just the easiest way that I find to do it. You can just go the whole way around. The main thing is we are going to be leaving a big gap in the bottom of our lining, but we'll get to that. So I have sewn up the bottom of my, like the sides. Now I'm going to just stitch across the bottom. So you want to go through and double check that all of your seam allowances are thick enough, because my edges are uneven. You can see that this seam allowance is just a little bit too small, and so I'm going to go over that one and just make it a little bit bigger so that it's not going to come apart when it's holding a book. Anyways, I just was talking to you and I wasn't even recording, so I fear I was just recording myself sewing the whole time. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. We're going to now sew up to the corner, keep the needle in, lift the foot, do a turn, and then sew it up about an inch in. Leave a big gap to about an inch on the other side, and then you can sew the rest of the way down, or you can come back to the other side and sew up and sew an inch in, same like the other side. Either way, you want to make sure that you leave a gap, back stitch before you cut your threads to make sure that it's nice and secure and it's not going to unravel as you pull the fabric through it. So I've left myself, oops, I've got myself quite a bit of a thicker sort of seam allowance on this side. It's like 1.5 centimeters. Gives us enough seam allowance so when it's flipped in you can sew it nice and easy. Makes this that bit easier. You can see I have back stitched on either side and left a nice gap there, and what we're going to do now is reach in to the very bottom. Actually, no, before we do this, we want to trim our corners, particularly if you've got quite a big bit of seam allowance. So So you want to go through, you don't want to get too close to the seam, but you do want to get a little bit closer to the seam. And trim the side. And trim the other side. And then just snip a little bit off the corner. And that is how we get nice sharp corners. Really important that you don't get too close so that it doesn't come undone. Do the same to the other corner. Before we pull the right sides out, we're going to stress test those corners. If they do pop, it's easier to fix them now. And all you need to do is just run over the seams again. So we're going to put our finger in, give it a press, nothing's coming undone. Fantastic. Do the same for the other side. Also helps you catch now if you've snipped your threads rather than after you've already flipped it around. Anyways, perfect. Do the same thing to your lining corners. Not quite as important to make these pristine, but just you can just do a little angled snip. Up to you. I draw my scissors. Anyways. Snip. Snip. Boom. So now what we do, like I was trying to say before I remembered. Sorry, I was just trimming my other edges because I should reduce bulk after putting another hole through my bobbin case. Anyways, we are finally, without any more interruptions, reaching in, pinching our corners, and carefully pulling back through. If you need to like relax the grip a little bit, or if you find it easier to do it a different way, that's totally fine. But there you go, now you have your little pocket. You can reach in like I like to do with some scissors. Bigger scissors, it makes this easier, but we'll do it closed. We'll do it the right way. Keep your scissors closed, pushing them into your project. It's going to be easier to do if you're holding tips. And then we're going to press out our corners with the scissors, and that way you get, compared to like pushing it just with my finger, you get a much nicer, sharper corner. This fabric's a little bit stretchy, so it also makes it look really pointy, but that's okay. We're just going to press out the rest of the seam too. Yeah, that's how you get these pristine corners. And then we're going to do the same thing while we've got the scissors inside. Do the same thing to our lining corners. Being careful if you do have a bit of a questionable amount of seam allowance. Don't press too hard, we don't want holes. If you do have a hole, just flip it back around, so the seam allowance. Now we have our long tube. You can see where the edges match up nicely because we took the time to line them up. That makes things easier in the next few steps. What we're going to do is we're going to do things the right way, and we are going to grab our iron. Here's one I prepared earlier. Grab our iron. It's on normal settings that the fabric can tolerate. This fabric can't tolerate the iron, but that's okay. This fabric can. We're going to make sure that our seam allowance is folded to the inside. Can you see that? Right. You can do this kind of just by pulling on the corners, and that will pull the two pieces of fabric together. We're then going to make sure that they line up nicely on both sides, and just use the iron to press that together. Makes it a little easier to do the next step of sewing that up. Now that we have pressed that nice and crisp, what we're going to do is just do a straight stitch about half a centimetre or so in, making sure that you're catching the seam allowance in there, just along this bottom edge. Yeah, just a straight stitch. If you haven't caught the seam allowance because you've sewn too far in, you can just do another row of stitching. It's all good. However, that will make the lining a little bit more shallower, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so we have sewn up the bottom there, nice and easy. What we're going to do now is flip our lining into the book sleeve. making it one thing, one-sided. Boom, bam, thank you, ma'am. What you have right there is a basic but functional book sleeve. What we're going to do though is we are going to do some top stitching across the top here that will just help to keep the lining in there a bit easier. Other things that you can do is doing the stitching down the whole side. I'm not going to do that because this fabric is thick already and it's just going to be difficult, and I honestly you don't need to do it that way. And then the next thing that we're going to do after we do that top stitching is the elastic and the button. I am rolling down the seam allowance to make sure that the top of my book sleeve is pretty sharp on the seam as best as possible, and also trying to turn our seam allowances in opposite directions as best we can to try and reduce bulk in the sides. Really important when you go over these sections to do it really, really slowly so that you don't break a needle, put a hole through your bobbin case, things like that. That is how I have put holes in my bobbin case. So yeah, sewing carefully over those bumps, but also being careful to make sure that this is rolled down. If your fabric can handle being pressed, I do recommend pressing this into place before doing that. My fabric is kind of a bit too annoying, a bit too thick, and doesn't tolerate ironing very well due to the velvetiness, but otherwise I'm just stitching down the lining and the outer fabric to make sure that they stay where we want them. So you can see here I have taken off the where is it? There you go, the storage compartment-y thing. That's just here. We don't need that on. Makes it easier to loop the book sleeve around the arm, so that we can do our top stitching. We go as close or as far away from the edge as you would like. This is an aesthetic choice at this point. Just making sure that you're keeping that edge nice and crisp, and it'll be functional wherever the seam is. The further in, the sort of better it does at keeping the lining down, but the further away it also means that the top can sort of roll just a little bit more because there's more give, if you will. So you can do 2 rows, it doesn't matter. I'm doing 1 because I have done so many of these today anyways. So that's the situation. I'm going to finish doing the top edge of my book sleeve. On this fabric here, honestly, you can't really see it because it's textured anyways, but on the inside you can see that we have the stitching there, keeping it nicely in place. Next step now is for the elastic and for the button. To get my elastic covered, because I only had white elastic and I didn't want to use white elastic on my dark book sleeve, I've covered it with bias tape, and all I've done is I have the thicker bias tape and I've just folded it over, sewing down the open edge and the other edge as well, just to make it nice and crisp, and then threaded my elastic through there. If you do this, don't start sewing the bias tape together from the edge, start from approximately what length you want. You just do this by measuring around the button. It's, you know, this much, hang on, let me measure it, about 10 or 11 centimeters long, a little bit less if you've got a smaller button or whatnot, or thinner books, or yeah. Anyways, starting from this edge, stitching down, and then again for the other side, starting at the other end and stitching towards the end. Once you've sewn it, cut it off at the length that you desire, and you can tidy up the threads on the end. Oops, sorry for the noise. Then we take our elastic and we measure it by lining it up to one edge, stretching as far as it goes, and to the other edge, giving making sure that it's at full stretch so that you get the best sort of scrunch and the best functionality from the elastic. We then take that measurement and cut our elastic exactly to that spot. It looks like not enough, but I promise it is. We just measured it out. I have an elastic threader, so I just put the elastic in this, and then we're going to thread the elastic through the little tube that we've just made. If you don't have one of these, you can use like a safety pin or something just to give a little more grip and make the end of the elastic a little bit more obvious. So, threading through the elastic, and what we're going to then do is, before we thread it all the way through, we have to we'll line up the edge with the fabric with the edge of the elastic, and we're going to stitch that in place. Much easier to do this if you have a little bit of paper that you put underneath as you stitch. Make sure whatever you're using to secure the other end is out of the way. But this is just the easiest to sew it now before the elastic is all scrunched up. Do a couple of where is it? There we go. A couple of back stitches, like back and forth in the same spot. And it helps to make sure it's nice and secured. And then we're going to cut the thread and pull the thing out. I didn't even intend to do it that way, but here we go. Rip the, so you can see, touched on both sides. Just going to tear off the paper. Now we're going to actually crunch on these threads. If there's any paper that you can still see on the other side, you can pick that up, but it doesn't really matter. And then we're going to pull through the elastic and pinch as you pull off your thing. And we're going to pull as much of the fabric down to the bottom and just slowly feed through the other side of our elastic. And we're going to do the same thing that we did to the other side, grabbing our paper, sewing it down. You can also use a tissue or I don't know, baking paper or whatever you like. Paper's, honestly, it's not very good for your needle. You probably shouldn't use normal paper. Tissue is probably better. Baking paper is also probably better. But just, you need something there to make sure that the machine doesn't eat the ends. So we have our piece of elastic. If you just use normal elastic, which is totally fine to do, like honestly, this is over the top and very fiddly and kind of tricky. You can just use normal elastic. We're going to bring our edges together. If you're using plain elastic, what you want to do is hold it straight across and fold one side in front and fold the other side in front, so that you have like a loop sort of thing. Yeah, this isn't the prettiest way of doing it, but it suffices. I've covered the bottom of my elastic. That was too hard to explain, so don't stress about it. What we're going to do now is sew this to the inside of the book sleeve. My goodness. Here we go. You can see I just used a straight stitch there. You can do the same thing if you just use straight elastic. Just do a straight stitch to sew it in place. Ideally, it would be in the seam, but that's its own other thing. Final step is to sew on the button. So all we do is flip over our loop and we find where the button would be. Interrupted, sorry. Flip it over and that is where our button goes. So we find our button, find where it goes. Mine's going, hard to do backwards. Mine will go right here, and you can do a little mark on the fabric with the same pen you used to do your lines, or you can sort of find a spot on the fabric where it goes, and then we're going to sew our button on. You know how to sew a button on, so I didn't bother showing you that part. But this is it done. And you've got your button loop, and you got your book cover. This one's actually one that I did before because I don't actually want to sew that button on this guy. Well, I want a different button and I have to go. This is how my other one turned out, but I did it the same mistake. But so this is what it looks like when you sew your elastic straight into your seam. It looks a lot neater, and I do recommend doing it this way. You just have to remember to do that before you sew it together. That's how you do it. Thank you for following along and making a book sleeve the easier way. Love you, bye.